This conference will now be recorded.
In yesterday's session, we were discussing about what is pod and how to create a pod. In pod also, we were discussing what is single container pod, what is multi-container pod, all those things. Now, I have a Kubernetes cluster already created. And one more thing what I wanted to say guys, you guys are stopping these servers after practicing. You guys are stopping these servers. And when you start your servers again, when you start these servers again, you guys are stopping and restarting your servers. You no need to again set up the cluster. You no need to execute kubedium. You need that kubedium join. That is already done. If you stop the servers and start these servers, does that cluster will be again up and running? Yes, it has all those details. Don't again do kubedium. You need kubedium join all these things. But if you terminated these servers, and create a new servers, then you need to set up the cluster again. Don't set up the cluster every time when you are stopping and starting. That is one thing. And make sure your servers are running. Let's say you started your master, but you have not started these workers. Then again, will you able to deploy your applications? Whatever applications you are already deployed, will you able to access those applications if the servers are down? No. So anytime you do anything, first make sure your servers are running and check kubectl get nodes. Check kubectl get nodes. When you are executing kubectl get nodes, what should be the status of your nodes? Whether it's a master or workers, what I have to see the status, it should be in a ready state. It should be in a ready state. If it is not in a ready state, which means do we have some issue with this node? Maybe node is down or kubelet is down. Node is, I mean to say server is up and running, but that server may not have enough CPU, enough memory. That kubelet might be down. So do I need to make sure these are ready first? Yes. Now yesterday we have deployed some application. Do I have this application up and running in this namespace? Yesterday we deployed. I want to see more details. I'm executing kubectl wide. What is this IP? Pod IP. Now this is, what is this IP? My node IP. In which node that pod is scheduled? In which node that pod is scheduled? That pod is scheduled in this node, which means the container which is part of that pod, is it running in this node? The container which is part of in this pod is running in this node. Now, if you remember, what is the container runtime we are using in these Kubernetes nodes? If you see kubectl get nodes -o wide, kubectl get nodes -o wide. Now, this is the kernel version, this is the operating system, and if you see runtime, container runtime, what is the container runtime we are using in these nodes? Container D. But whatever image I have created, is that image created using Docker file? Is it able to run that Docker image in the container D runtime? Are we able to run that Docker image? Are we able to run that as a container on the container D? If you see, yes. Which means, can we still use Docker? Docker is a still powerful container software. We can use to create and manage the images. We can use for creating and managing the images. Now, my pod is running. That pod has container. How many containers we have in that pod as of now? One. Now, how to access that one? Now how to access that application which is running as a Kubernetes pod container? How to access within the cluster, how I can access, outside the cluster, how I can access? Let me tell you. There is a concept called service. There is a concept called service in Kubernetes. This is different. This is for communication. Now, before I explain service, I have a pod IP. Can I use this pod IP also? Can I use this pod IP also to access? Will I able to use this pod IP for accessing that application which is running as a container in that pod? I can use this pod IP, but does that pod IP will work only within the cluster? Let's say this is my Kubernetes cluster. Let's say this is my Kubernetes cluster. I have some nodes here. I have some nodes here. I have some nodes here. My pod is running. Within the pod, I have a container. Within the pod, I have a container. This is my Maven app container. On which port this container is running? What is the container port? 80. Now, this is my pod IP. 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 Pod IP. So in which node that is running? That is running in this node, 101 node, right? In 101 node. So this is the node IP. Can I call this as a node IP? Again, this node is nothing but your server. This is private IP. Private IP of that server. Now, this is my cluster. Within the cluster, will I able to use this IP address and this port, whatever port, that container port which is running in that pod? Now within the cluster, maybe from this node or maybe from this node, will I able to access this container using this pod IP and that respective container port within the cluster? Now, if you observe, is this node is also part of the cluster, whatever current node, that is basically your master node. This 215 is your master node. So from this node, basically, I'm using curl. I'm using curl, that pod IP, because this is a Linux machine. This is a Linux machine. We don't have any browser. Now, pod IP, my application context. What is my application context? I think Maven's -web application / is also required. Now, if you see, am I getting response status code 200? This one, because this is my pod IP. What is this port? Inside that pod, we have one container. That container is running on which port? That container is running on 8080. So within the cluster, am I able to access? Not only from this node. If I go to this node or this node also, if I SSH to that node when I do the curl also, that will I able to access the other node, worker nodes also? Let's say this one. Let's say this one. Let me connect to that server. Let me connect to that server. This is my master node, worker node. Guys, here I can use this also. I can use this pod IP. Do you see? Is it working here also? Because this is also part of the cluster. Now, same thing if I do from other server which is not part of the cluster. Let's say other server. Let's say other server. Let's say this server. But they are in the same VPC, same network, same VPC, that is same server networking. But is it part of pod networking? I mean to say, is that server is part of your cluster? Let's say this server is not part of the cluster. So let me connect to this server. If I do the same curl, let me exit from here. Let me exit from here. Let me connect here. Now here, if I do the same, am I able to access? Am I able to reach this IP on this port? No. Because is this part of the cluster? No. Within the cluster, I can access. If I access this one from a different machine, that can be your laptop or other desktop, or that is not one more AWS server or one more normal server, will I able to access using that pod IP from outside the cluster? No. But again, within the cluster also, is it recommended to use pod IPs? I mean to say, you deployed one more microservice. You deployed one more microservice, one more application. This application want to make a call with this application. Is it recommended to use pod IP for one application to reach another application within the cluster also? This is going to work, but is it recommended to give that? Suppose this is one more application, another application. This application want to make a communication with this application. This is one microservice. This is another microservice running in a same cluster. This guy has to make a call to this guy. Is it recommended to use like this in the code by the developers? Again, by the developer, as a developer, is it recommended to use like this within the cluster also if you want to communicate? No. Why? What is the problem? Why we should not use pod IPs within the cluster also? Whatever you know, guys. Whatever you know, just try to answer. Same for all pods. Huh? As I already told, is pod IPs will be same for all the pods. As I already told, each and every pod will have a unique IP address in the cluster. Does each and every pod will have a unique IP address in the cluster? No. It is not because of same pod IP. Because do we have a control on the pod IPs, which means, let's say, if this pod is deleted, and recreated, do you have a guarantee that you are going to get a same pod IP? No. If pod IPs are changed, again, do I need to modify the code, the other applications code where I have to use that new IP? Is that correct? No. That is one reason. One more reason. In real time, are you going to have only one pod, one replica like this? Are you going to have one pod or one replica like this? No. Are you going to have a multiple replicas like this? Two pods or three pods like this? So if I have a multiple pods, do I need some kind of a load balancing also within the cluster? If I directly use IP here, request always goes to this pod. It will not distribute the load to this pod. Do I need some kind of a load balancing between these pods, multiple replicas? No. So as I already told, in Kubernetes, there is one concept called service discovery and load balancing. So Is it recommended to use this pod IPs if I want to do the load balancing or service discovery? No. So instead of doing this way, in Kubernetes, there is a concept called service. Can I create a service? Someone was saying use the pod names. Pod names also we will not use. We will not use the pod names. We will not use pod names. So we will use service. The way we have a pods, can I create a one more Kubernetes called service? One more Kubernetes called service. Now, when I create a service, service will have a IP address and name. Service also will get IP address and name. So this service IP, we call it as a service IP or virtual IP. We call it this as a service IP or virtual IP, and it will have a name also. Service IP or virtual IP. The service also will get one IP address. I need to create a service. Service will have an IP address and name. Again, do I need to use this IP address, this service IP address to access these pods? Not required. Can I use the name, whatever name I have used to create that service? Let's say I have created a service name like this, Maven Web App SVC. Now, can I use that service name here? So when I use this service name, is that service name resolved to this IP, that service IP, that virtual IP? Yes. Is that service will act as a load balancing? Does this service will send the traffic to the pods within the cluster? We can create a service. Service will act as a load balancer here. So there is a concept called service. Guys, sometimes in the interview they are asking this question also. What is the difference between Docker service and Kubernetes service? What is the difference between Docker service and Kubernetes service? In Docker also we have a service. In Kubernetes also we have a service. But is both are same? Is both are same? What is Docker service? In the Docker, what do you mean by service? You already know. Can you explain what do you mean by Docker service? What is Docker service first? Come on, guys. We already discussed Docker service. What do you mean by Docker service? In Docker, service will manage the container replicas, and also can I use that service name also for communication within the Docker Swarm cluster? Can I use that service name if one application has to communicate with other application, other service? Can I use that service name? Which means in Docker Swarm, each service is managing both. Each service is managing containers as well as communication also. So Docker service, is it doing both managing the containers and load balancing the containers, accessing and load balancing the containers? Is everything is taken care by single object called Docker service in Docker Swarm? In Docker Swarm, we are creating a service. Service is creating and managing the containers. And at the same time, am I able to use that service name within the cluster if I want to reach that replicas, that service replicas, that service containers? Guys, you have practically done that also. You have practically done that also. You created a Spring Boot application, you created a Mongo application, or you deployed Java web application or Maven web application. When I was demonstrating, was am I able to access that using service name, the Docker service name? Which means service is managing containers as well as we can access using the service name. But in Kubernetes, service is different. In Kubernetes, does Kubernetes service will create and manage the pods, containers? In Kubernetes, does Kubernetes service will create a pods? Does Kubernetes service will manage the pods and containers? No. So in Kubernetes, is service is responsible only for communication and load balancing within the cluster? Yes. So in Kubernetes, there is a concept called service. In Kubernetes, there is a concept called service. Now let me explain what is service Kubernetes in Kubernetes, then we will proceed. Communication is very important. So in Kubernetes, we have a service. What is service? A service is responsible for making our pods discoverable, which means accessible. The service is responsible for making our pods discoverable inside the network or exposing them to the outside. It is responsible for making our pods discoverable, identifying the pods and accessing those pods inside the network or exposing them to the internet. Internet in the sense outside the cluster. But how service will identify pods? I have different pods created. Let's say this is this application pod. This is one more application. Let's say I have deployed different application. Let's say this is a Java web app pod. Now I am creating a service, but how service will identify the pods? How this service will identify to which pods it has to send the traffic? How it will identify? Service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors. Service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors. That is very, very important. While creating a pod, is it possible for me to give a labels for that pod? Yesterday also we have given label. Did I give a label like this while creating a pod? Did I create a label for like this? Now, these labels, can I use it as a selectors here while creating a service, Kubernetes service? Because service has to identify the pods. So how service will identify the pods? Service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors, which means now here, can I use those labels as a selectors here while creating a service in Kubernetes? Selectors or selector. Can I say something like this? Now, within my complete cluster, with this label, how many pods are there? Let's say if it has only one pod, let's say if it has only one pod with that label, does this service will route the traffic to this pod? If anyone access the application via this service, let's say I have multiple replicas, multiple pods. Now, how many pods, how many endpoints this service will have? Endpoints are nothing but your pods. So how many endpoints this service will have now if I have something like this? If I have something like this, how many endpoints I will have? 2. But does this pod, I mean to say, does this service will send the traffic to this pod? Will it consider this pod or any other pod? If this pod is having with the different labels, suppose this pod I created with a different label, let's say app Java web app. Now, do you think this service will route the traffic to this pod? Because service is created with this selector? No. So within Kubernetes, if I want to access the application within the cluster, if I want to access the application or outside the cluster also, if you want to access the application, do I need to create a service? Kubernetes service, that is one object. It is responsible for making our pods discoverable or accessible inside the network. Inside the network in the sense inside the cluster. inside the cluster? And will I able to expose that pods also to outside the cluster using service again? Yes. Service will identify the pods based on the labels. Now there are different types of services again. There are different types of services, Kubernetes services. What are those? Yesterday, I think I already explained. One is cluster IP, another one is node port, another one is headless, one more is load balancer. This is external load balancer, or cloud load balancer. The service itself will act as a load balancer within the cluster. The service of type load balancer is an external load balancer. So this we will discuss later. Okay. Now we have a different types of services, cluster IP service, node port service, like this. Now cluster IP service. When I create a service of type cluster IP, that will expose the service on a cluster internal IP. This is, we call it as a this one. This we call it as a cluster IP or service IP or virtual IP. So basically this is my service. This is my service. So when I create a service of type cluster IP, it will expose the services on cluster internal IP. Service is only reachable within the cluster. If I create a service of type cluster IP, will I able to reach that service only within the cluster? This is my Kubernetes cluster, let's say. Will I able to reach only within the cluster if I create a service of type cluster IP? Yes. And also, if I am not mentioning the type, what type of service I am creating, what is the default one? What is the default type of service which gets created? Again, cluster IP only. That is the default one. Now, what is going to happen in the background? What is going to happen in the background when I'm creating a service? Understand, guys, this is very, very important. Communication is very, very important. So when we create a service, what is going to happen in the background? I am going to get one virtual IP or cluster IP. I am talking about this one. When we create a service, we will get one virtual IP or cluster IP, that we call it as a service IP. Is that IP will be get registered with the DNS? Is that IP will be registered with the DNS? If you remember, within Kubernetes, do we have a DNS, kube DNS or core DNS? Do you have some DNS also running within the cluster? If you observe, within my cluster, do you have a DNS also running? That is within the cluster. kubectl get pods -n kube system. So do I have a kube DNS or core DNS? That is Kubernetes DNS. Do I have some DNS pods also, DNS solution also running in my cluster? In a kube system namespace, do we have some Kubernetes DNS or kube DNS or core DNS pods also running? So, which means when we create a service of type, any type, not only cluster IP, I am going to get one IP. Is that IP will be registered in the DNS with that name, whatever name I am using. Let's say I am creating a service with this name. Does this name will be mapped with this IP address in the kube DNS within the cluster? We have that core DNS or kube DNS. That is service discovery. Right? So we have a DNS also. This IP will get registered with this name. So again, if this application, another application want to access this application, do they really need to use the pod IPs of this one, or do they really need to use again this IP? Do I need to use service IP? Not required. Can I use that name instead of this IP or pod IPs? Can I use this name, whatever name I have used to create a service here? If I use this name, if I use this name, does DNS lookup will happen within the cluster? We have a DNS solution running in the cluster. Does the DNS lookup happen within the cluster? Is it going to resolve that name to whatever service IP? Request goes to service. Then does this service will forward the traffic to the pods? Does this service will forward the traffic to the pods like this? But how service will identify the pods? To which pod it has to route? What are the endpoints of the service? How it will identify? Labels and selectors. So when we create a service, we are going to get one virtual IP address that will get registered into the DNS. Pods can find and talk to this using service name. As we already discussed, service is just a logical concept. Service is just a logical concept. Code, some code. But the real work will be done by whom in the background? The actual work will be done by whom in the background? In the architecture, I was explaining one component. In the architecture, I was explaining one component. So is this networking rules? Is this networking rules will be maintained by kubeproxy? If request comes to service, to which pod it has to forward the traffic? Does all these networking connection forwarding rules will be maintained by kubeproxy? So service is a logical concept. Actual work will be done by kubeproxy. So what kubeproxy does? Does kubeproxy route the traffic from cluster IP to pod IPs in the background? We are accessing cluster name, service name. The kubeproxy will forward the traffic from this cluster IP to your pod IPs. So who is going to actually taken care by this? Kubeproxy. Is everyone clear? When I am creating a service, what is happening in the Kubernetes? How service will identify the pods? Why we need a service? If I am using service, do I need to worry about the changes in my pod IPs? Let's say this pod is deleted. This pod is deleted and recreated with a different IP. Do I need to worry? If I am using service concept here, if I am using a service name, if this pod is deleted and recreated with different IP, I no need to worry. Now, if this service has multiple pods like this, does the service will act as a load balancing also? Service discovery and load balancing also in the cluster. So is it going to suit our requirements? Microservices architecture, you are deploying multiple microservices as a containers, as a pods. That containers can go down anytime, that containers can come up. Will I able to use this name for communicating one application with another application within the cluster and load balance that application also within the cluster? Yes. So service is a logical concept. Actual work will be done by kubeproxy. Now this is example of manifest. This is example of manifest. This is example of manifest. Now, if I create as is, do you think it will work for our application now? If I create as is, do you think it will work for our application? This is sample. Do I need to make sure I am using right selectors here? Whatever I have given labels for my application, do I need to use that correct selectors here? Yes. And also, do I need to mention these ports also properly? These ports also properly. This target port. You have one port called target port. Do I need to make sure I am giving a correct target ports? So this is service port. This is service port. On which port your service has to accept the traffic? Can I use any port on this service? It can be 80 or it can be 8080 or any port. On which port the service should accept the traffic? That can be any port. So when I'm using that service name, does request goes to that service on whatever port I have used here as a service port? Yes. Then is that service will route the traffic to the pods on the given target port, whatever target port I have used, does that service will route the traffic to the pods on the given target port? Yes. Now this is sample, but let me create a service. Guys, if required, can I have multiple Kubernetes resources in a same YML instead of creating a separate YML? Can I have, say, in the same YML, can I create other also by separating YML? In YML, what this represents? This three dashes, is it going to be a one more resource? Yes. So here, can I write something like this? API version, kind, metadata, spec. Guys, yesterday I was still observing some guys are using K caps. Is it correct? Some guys were using K caps. Is it correct? No. Kind. Now, what kind of resource I want to create now? What kind of object I want to create or what kind of resource I want to create? I need to create a service. Service. Again, is this correct? Yes, a small here. Kind. No. Now, what is the API version for this service? What is the API version for this service? I have given some table here also. I have given some table here also. If you see, here, I have given one table. I have given one table here. But only few things I have given, but that doesn't matter. If you see, kind is service. If let's say if kind is service, what is the API version for service? V1. V1. Now, even though you don't have this table, what command you can use to see the kinds and the API versions, all those things? What command I can use so that I can see what are the Kubernetes resources, what is the API version for that? I can use kubectl API resources, it will list all those things. Now V1, again, is this correct? People are making lot of mistakes here. So V1, V small 1. Metadata. This metadata is what basically? I can write a service like this. API version, kind, metadata, spec. So kind, service, API version V1, metadata, name. This name is for what? This name is for what? This metadata is basically for this one. So this name is for what? Whatever name I am going to give that, that is a service name. Name of the service. Name of the service. If required, can I add a labels also to this service? This is labels for your service. But are we going to use these labels anywhere? Is it mandatory to use labels for service? Not required, because we are not using these labels anywhere. These are the labels for service. Now, namespace. Do I need to mention in which namespace I have to create this service like this? The namespace name, the namespace name. If I don't mention the namespace, in which namespace this service gets created? Default. But one scenario, you have your pods in the test namespace. If you create a service for that pods in the default namespace, do you think will it work? You have your pods in test namespace, but if you create that service in a default namespace, do you think it will work? No. So do I need to make sure in whatever namespace I have my pods, do I need to create a service for that pods also in same namespace? In whatever namespace you have your pods, in the same namespace you need to create a service for that pods. Now namespace here, spec. What is this specification? Is your exactly like this? Is the specification of service also like this? Whatever you have a pod specification, is it something like this here in the spec? No. This is service specification. Does this specification will be different based on the kind of resource you are creating? The kind of resource you are creating, the specification will change. So here we have something like this type. Here, what are the possible values? Service type, cluster IP, node port, or load balancer. This is external load balancer, which will not work now. Even though I say service type load balancer, you are not going to get any external load balancer. This I will explain later. Now, what type of service I want to create? For now, if I want to expose that application only in the cluster, I don't want anyone to reach that application from outside. Only within the cluster, that service should be accessible. Then what type of service? Can I create a service of type cluster IP? Cluster IP, C caps, IP caps. Okay, cluster IP. Now, the most important thing here is selector. Selector. Here, what I need to give? Whatever pod label key I used, that one, and that pod label value. So here under selector, do I need to use pod labels as selectors here? Do I need to use this pod labels as a selectors here? This plays very important role. This play key role here. Let's say your pods have this label app Maven web app, but while creating a service, let's say I am using name as a key, value as Maven web app. Do you think the service will discover the pods? Do you think this service will have endpoints? No. So this is very, very important. Let's assume my pod has multiple labels. Is it mandatory to use all those labels here? Let's say I have multiple labels on pod. Is it mandatory to use all those labels? Not required. Any one or all. You can use all or any one. Here we are giving pod labels as a selectors. Pod labels as a selectors here. Then what next? Ports. Mapping. We have a port, we have a target port. So this target port is nothing but what? The target port is nothing but your container port. Your container port. Now this port is nothing but what? This is your service port. This is your service port. On which port the service should accept the traffic? On which port the service should accept the traffic? Then once it receives the traffic on this port, on which port it has to forward the traffic to the pods? That is port. Here you have a one more option called node port that I will explain what is this node port when I go for a different service. Now this is my service manifest. Now let me create a service now. API version. Can I give any name here, guys? Something like this, any name can I give service? Something like this, any name, even ABC also fine. Yes, but some meaningful name. Give the meaningful name. Now let me create a spec. Let me define the spec here. Again, type cluster IP selector selector. Now these are my pod labels: app, Maven, web app. Now here value is same, but I am using a different key. service will be created, service will have a cluster, that IP, virtual IP, but does that service will have any endpoints, which means does that service will have any pods in the background? Will it have any endpoints? Will it have a pod details? No, because the service will identify the pods based on what? Labels and selectors. Labels and selectors. So do I need to use correct labels? The service is for which pods? Do I need to clearly use those labels? You are creating a service, but that service is for which pods? That is depends on your labels. Let me show you. I am not giving any correct label. Let's say value is matching, but key is not same. Let me give incorrect only so that you can understand easily. Now ports. When it comes to port section, you have two things. One is port. This can be default port also, 80. If it is a default port like this, does any other application can just use this service name without any port also? Can they use this service name? Other application? Because and which port request goes? And which port request goes? Default port 80. Let's say if I have created a service on 8080, then whoever want to reach that service, do they need to use something like this? If the service is also created on 8080, do they need to use something like this? Service name and service port like this? Yes. So it can be on any port, that can be 80 or 8080 like this. If it is 80, you can access like this. But again, is it mandatory even though you don't use this one? What is the default port and which port request goes? 80. 80. But let's consider you have created a service like this. You have created a service on port 8080. But if you access like this, do you think it will work again? If you access like this, do you think it will work again? No. If you access like this also, it won't work. But if I have, do I need to access like this, that service? Do I need to access like this? If service is created on port 8080 like this? Yes. So that can be anything, port 80. Now target port. So target port is nothing but within that ports, on which container port you want to route the traffic. The service has to route the traffic to which target port in that pod. So can I say 8080 here? But again, is it always 8080? Let's say I'm creating a service for Node.js application. I'm creating a service for Node.js application, that Node.js pods. Then is always 8080? No. This is based on your container, on which port you are running. I am doing one more mistake here. Did I mention the service and namespace? In which namespace I want to create this service? So when I apply this one, in which namespace it will get created? In which namespace it will be created? If you see kubectl get all -n test -ns. Service is created, but is that service is showing here? I am saying all. Instead of all, you can get only service also by executing this command. Is that, do I have that service created in that namespace? No. But in which namespace that is created? Do I have that service created in default namespace? There are two problems now. There are two problems. One is service is created in a different namespace. Another one is I'm using wrong labels. I'm using wrong labels. Now, let me describe this service. If I want to see more details about this service, can I describe like this? SVC, short form, kubectl describe SVC. SVC is short form. I can describe this service. Now, if you see this service, do I have any endpoints here for that service? Do I have any endpoints here for that service? No. Guys, what is this IP? What is this IP? Whatever I see here, 10.97.157.245, can I call that as a service IP? or that cluster IP. Now, is this IP is mapped with this name within the cluster in the kube DNS or core DNS? Yes. Now, I created a service, but now if anyone access this service using this IP or using this name, do you think it will work? I can use this IP also. Let me show you. I'm using service IP now. I'm using service IP. Service is created on port 80. Do I need to mention any port? Is it mandatory since service is created on port 80? Not required. Now my application context. My application context I am using. Am I getting a response? Am I getting a response back from that service? Request went to service on port 80. Service is saying connection refused. Why it is saying connection refused? Because is this service has any endpoint? No. No endpoint. Endpoint is nothing but what? Your pods. Your pods. Now let me correct that service. What I will do, again I will update that file. Now let me give a correct label. Correct label. App. This is my pod labels. I'm using that as a selector. Let me give a correct label and apply again. I'll apply that file again. Now, even though I am using correct labels, do I still have a endpoints here? Even though I'm using a correct labels as a selector, do I have an endpoint here? No. Why? Why I don't have any endpoint? In this namespace where I have a service, in this namespace where I have a service, do I have any pods with that labels? Whatever I'm using as a selectors, whatever I'm using as a selectors here, this selectors, do I have any pods in that namespace where I have a service? No. But do I have these in other namespace? This is one option, guys. Hyphen show labels. So when I'm using this kubectl get pods hyphen show labels, is it showing the labels of that pod? Yes. But I have a pods with this label. But is it in the same namespace where your service is created? No. So this way it won't work. Do I need to make sure that service is created? I will delete this service. I will delete this service. That is of no use here. I will delete this service. Delete svc, that service. Now, can I create a service in the other namespace here? Can I simply say namespace? Can I simply say namespace test -ns? Now again, if you do have a mistakes here, again, do you think the service will identify the pods even though they are in the same namespace? No. Guys, I'm explaining at very basic level. This is very, very important. How service will work, how service will identify the pods, why service, you can understand this way only. So that's why I'm making a lot of mistakes and explaining. Now let me create in a correct namespace, but I'm not using correct labels as a selectors here. Let me apply this. Let me apply this. Now I have a service also. I have a service also. kubectl get all in the that namespace. Do I have a pod? Do I have a service also in that namespace? Yes. But still, am I able to reach? I'm using this IP for now. I'm using this IP. I no need to use any port because service is running on that port. Now this is my application context. Am I able to reach? Still it is saying connection refused. Why it is saying connection refused? Do I have any endpoints? Let me describe that service. Let me describe that service. Why this error? Why this error? Because kubectl is trying to describe this service in a default namespace, but do I have that service in the default namespace? No, that is in test 10s. Now, do I have endpoints here? Do I have endpoints here? No. Why? In my service, what is the selector I am using? Name, Maven, web app. But do I have any pods? Do I have any pods with that label in that namespace? I have a pod. I have a pod with this label. I have a selector like this in the service. This is matching, but is key is same? Is key same? It's a key value pair, right? It is not same. So that's why, is it able to resolve this? Service is able to resolve to this pod? Is service is able to use this as an endpoint? No. Now what is the solution for this? What is the solution for this? Now how can I fix this problem? Labels and selectors should be same. There are two things. Either can I update the labels of my pod? Can I update the labels of my pod, or can I update the selectors of my service? I can update the labels of my pod as a name Maven web app, or can I update my selector, service selector, as a app Maven web app? There are two options. Either you modify the pod labels, or either you update the service selectors. Guys, on the fly also will I able to do like this kubectl edit. Imperatively also can I modify Kubernetes resources like this kubectl edit. What you want to edit? Let's say you want to edit service. I want to edit this service. -n that namespace name -o yaml. So when I do like this on the fly, is it going to open that service for editing? Imperatively also can I edit? Yes. Imperatively also you can edit. But if you are doing imperatively, whatever file you are using for deploying, is that in that file these things will get updated? Whatever file you are using, no. But will this updated directly in the cluster, directly in the API server etcd? Yes. You can do it imperatively also. But if you are making imperatively, if I press enter like this, is it open for editing imperatively? Now can I update here? You need to press Control I, just I. You press I, you press I. Insert mode. Here I can make changes. App escape colon WQ. Escape colon WQ. Will it directly update in the cluster? If I press now escape colon WQ, will it directly update in the cluster? Yes. But if I don't want to do this way, if I don't want to do this way, I am pressing escape Q colon. I don't want to edit like this. Now can I modify declaratively? Can I update this YML in the source like this? Then can I apply? Can I apply? kubectl apply -f that file again. Now if you see, now you see, I have a parts with this. Now I have a service also. Service -o wide. I am using service -o wide. Now I have a pod with this label, service with this selector. Now if I use this service for communication, is the service will identify this pod and will it route the traffic to that pod? Now if you see the service, let me describe the service again. Now can I see some endpoint here? Can I see some endpoint here now? What is this endpoint? What is this IP? What is that IP? Whatever I see that IP, what is that IP? Is it that pod IP? This one is this the pod IP 10.44.0.1. Now, when I use this IP, service IP, is it going to route the traffic to this IP and port internally? If I use this service IP, is it internally going to route the traffic to this one? Kind of a reverse proxy, guys. Kind of a reverse proxy. Now, if I have multiple pods here with same labels, I have a one more pod. Same application is deployed as two replicas, two pods. Same application is deployed as two replicas or three replicas or four replicas. Same application, multiple pods. Will I able to see all those things as endpoints here? Instead of one endpoint, can I see two endpoints or four endpoints based on the number of replicas, number of pods you have for that application? Will I able to see? That's what I have explained here in this already I have explained here, right? So if I have multiple pods like this, same application deployed multiple, will I able to see both pods as a endpoints in my service? Now, does that service will act as a load balancer? Will it distribute the traffic? Does that service will distribute the traffic between those endpoints, those pods within the cluster? So, does this service will act as a discovery and load balancing? Does this Kubernetes service will act as a service discovery and load balancing? It will discover and also do the load balancing. Now, when I access the service now, when I'm accessing using this service IP curl -v, that service IP, service is created on which port? Port 80. So I can use like this. I can use like this. There is no problem. But can I use like this? Can I use like this? Because this is your service IP. This is your service IP, this IP. Can I use like this? I will not get any response. I will not get any response because each service is working on this port or service is listening or created on this port. No, I will not get any response. That is service port 80. Now, when I'm using this service IP, basically this IP and this port, request goes to service. Is service is going to route the traffic to this endpoint? Is it going to route the traffic to that pod on that port? No. Now, am I getting a response from that pod? Am I getting the response from that pod? Now, since service is running on port 80, is it mandatory to use 80 again? Even though I don't use what is the default port, request goes 80. Now, am I getting a response? But again, does this service will work outside the cluster? Like this machine is not part of your cluster, let's say. This machine is not part of your cluster, let's say. Again, will it work, that service? From a different machine which is not part of the cluster? No. But from any other machine which is part of the cluster, let's say not this one more machine, let's say another worker machine, not this one. Let me take one more machine, maybe any other machine like worker or master, like this one, or maybe this one. Let's take any machine. Within that machine, from this machine, is service IP also working, which means is that service will work within the cluster only. Let me use that service details, something like this. Now, is it working here also? Because this is also part of the cluster. Yes. Now, can I use that service from my laptop like this, from a different server which is not part of that cluster? Can I access like this? First of all, no. But again, this is only within the cluster. But again, is it recommended to use this IP, that service IP? Again, Because service IP, when the service IP will be allocated, the service IP will be allocated while creating a service. Do you need to wait till that IP is getting created? For other application has to wait? Not required. Can they go with name? Do you have a control on the name? What name you can use for service? Do you have a control on the name? So instead of IP, can I use name? Can I use name instead of IP of that service? Can I use service name, whatever name I have used? Whatever name I have used for that service, let's say this one. But does this names will directly resolve from the node itself? From the node, I mean to say from the server. Does this names will resolve to IPs directly from the node? Node in the sense directly like this. Do you think it will resolve? No. It will not resolve to the IP when I am accessing directly from the node. Node in the sense server. Server. Am I getting error saying that could not resolve host? Am I getting error saying that could not resolve host? Which means these names will work. But where these names will work? Does these names will work within the pods? Within the pods? Yes. Not directly from the host. Not directly from the host. Now let's say I deployed one more application. I deployed one more application as a pod. Then can I use that name in the pod? It will not resolve directly in the node. It will resolve only in the pod. Which means, will I able to use this Kubernetes services directly from the node? Any application which is running directly in the node, will it work? It is not running as a pod. That application is not running as a pod. Will you able to use that service name even though you are running some application in this server, but that is not running as a pod? Do you think will you able to use this service name? No. So that service name will resolve only within the pods. Only within the pods. Now, just to demonstrate, I'll create one pod. I'll create one pod. Maybe imperatively or declaratively, I'll create one more application. Now let me create a one more application. Let's say, let me deploy another application, maybe that Node.js app. Now here, I'm creating one more pod, another application. Can I do something like this? API version, kind, pod, metadata, name, name of the pod. Let's say Node.js pod, something like this. Namespace, namespace. Let's say test-ns. Spec. The labels are important. Guys, do you think is this correct? Is this correct? If I create a pod like this, that Kubernetes service, whatever we created for other application, will it start sending the traffic to this pod also? This Node.js pod? Do you think this is correct? If the services start sending the traffic to this pod, in this pod, do you have any container which is running on 8080? Or do you have that application deployed in this pod container? No. So do you need to make sure you are using labels and selectors carefully? Otherwise, you are expecting your service to route the traffic to one pod. Will it send the traffic to different pod altogether where you don't have any application for that service? Yes. So make sure you are using proper labels and selectors. So this is not like this. Can I give something like this for this pod? Can I give something like this? Are you getting what I am trying to say? Now let's say you are running different application in this pod. You are deploying a different image, different container in this pod. You are deploying this one on this port, but you are using labels like this. You are using labels like this. Now, does your service will start sending the traffic to this pod also? Whatever service you created for other application? Yes. But If request goes to this pod, do you think it will work? You are trying to reach other application, you will end up reaching different application. Do you think will it work if you do like this? No. So do I need to make sure I'm using proper labels and selectors based on the applications you are deploying? Yes, that is very, very important. These type of issues we will observe frequently, guys. These type of issues we will observe frequently because they may mess up with labels or selectors like that. You are expected to route the traffic to one pod, but traffic is going to different pod. Do you get a response? Will it work as expected? No. Now, let me give uniquely. This is pod specification, containers, name of the container. I can give something like this. Guys, one more thing, within a namespace, do I need to have a unique names used for this Kubernetes object? I already have a pod with this Node.js app. Can I reuse same name within that namespace? No. But can I use names? Can I reuse the names in different namespaces? Suppose in this namespace I have this name used, but in a default namespace, can I again reuse the same name if required? Yes. But within the namespace, object name should be unique. Now let me say image. I will deploy this image, proper image. That image should be there. That image should be there. Can we use the same manifest file? Yes, but is that correct? Again, you need to follow some best practices. This is different application. That is different application. Are you going to write everything in a single YML file? You have hundreds of microservices. You want to deploy each microservice. Are you going to write that pods services for all those microservices in a single file? No. Guys, these are like a best practices, right? Are like a minimum, you need to apply some minimum knowledge. I mean to say, you need to think whether I am doing whatever I am doing is correct. Like kind of a minimum common sense, I can say, or minimum knowledge. So is it correct to define everything in a single YML file? Will it become very lengthy? Will it become for maintaining that single file, modifying that single file? It is getting a lot of confusions, right? So each microservice will have its own Docker file. Similarly, does each microservice will have its own Kubernetes files, like a pod YML, service YML, deployment YML, whatever you wanted to create? Yes. Now let me access this my repository. Now I have a repository. In this, I have a Node.js application here, image. That Node.js application image is there. I can use whatever tag which is available as part of this repository. Let's say I have a tag like this, Docker hands-on slash node hyphen app hyphen mss, like this. Ports, container port. On which port this is running? I think 9981. This is minimum. Now I'm creating a pod. Kubectl apply -f node.js app. There is some typo, I think. There is some typo, I think. There is some typo error. Now do I have a pod created kind of another application? Do I have another application also running as a pod container now? Does this pod has that Node.js application container running in that? Still it is creating. That's why it is showing 0 by 1. Once it is successfully created, it will show 1 by 1. Now, let's consider this is one microservice and this is another microservice. Now, this application want to communicate with this application. Within this application code, can we use this service name to reach this application now? Within this application code, can we use this service name to reach this application? Now, I want to prove that there is no code here. I want to prove that from this application, from this pod container, I can reach this application using service. I want to prove because there is no code here. Can I go inside this pod container the way we went inside the container using Docker exec in Kubernetes also? Can I go inside the pod container for troubleshooting or any other things also? Yes. So what is the command? What is the command here? kubectl exec -it this pod name namespace. In which namespace I have that pod? That namespace hyphen like this bash or sh or bin/bash like this I can give directly like this hyphen. There should be a space here hyphen space. So which means is this command will be interactively executed against this pod container. But let's say there are multiple containers. As of now, how many containers is part of that pod? How many containers is part of that pod as of now? In that pod, how many containers we have? One. So does this command will interactively executed in that container since we have a single container, which means will I land inside that pod container, whatever we have? Yes. Let's say I have two containers. Let's say I have two containers in that pod. In that case, this command get executed against which container out of those two pods? Whatever we have in the 0th index, which means whatever we have in the first position. If I have multiple containers, I want to do this in a different container, I can use one more option, -c, that container name, whatever container name you used. So what is this -c stands for? If I have multiple containers, if I want to execute this command in a different container, I want to go inside a different container in that pod. What is this -c stands this? What is that -c stands? Container name. But when I have a single container, that -c is not mandatory. Now will I go inside that container now? Now where I am in this, where I am in? Am I inside this pod, inside that Node.js container now? Now if you see here, let's see if I have a curl. Curl is there. Now curl -v. Can I use this service name? Even though I am using this service name, now does this service name will be resolved to this pod IP? Sorry, this cluster IP, that service IP. Now if you see maven web application /. Now do you see, is it resolving to that IP, that service IP? Is that name resolved to service IP? So within the pod, within the cluster, can I use this service name instead of using your pod IPs, your service IPs or node IPs? Within the cluster, can I use this service name? This is very, very important, guys. In the interview also they'll ask. Now this is the case. This application want to reach other application. The container in one pod want to communicate with container in another pod. What do we use? Do I use a concept called service? Do we use a concept called service name? But within same pod, within same pod, one container has to communicate with another container. Do I really need a service for this one? One container want to communicate with another container. Do I really need to create a service for this use case? Let's say this container has to reach this container. Do I really need a service? No. So within the pod, how one container can communicate with another container? Can I use local host and port? Can I use local host and port? Yes. But this pod has one container. That container has to reach another container which is in a different pod. We can use pod IPs. We can use pod IPs, but is that recommended? As I already told, no. Instead of using pod IPs, can I create a service? Can I create a service and use that service name like this? Can I use that service and can I use that service name like this? Now, if the service has multiple endpoints, if the service has multiple endpoints, is that service will act as a load balancer also now within the cluster? Yes, but it will work only within the pods. You don't need that much in detail. But let me explain why this is happening. How come it is only working within the pod? Where is that resolve.conf? Resolver.conf. One second. If you see this resolver.conf, this resolver.conf is like some DNS setting. When we are creating a pod and a container in that pod, is Kubernetes is adding some details like name servers details here. This is like a DNS lookup. So when we are using any host names, kind of a names from within this pod container, is it kind of a doing a lookup on this name server, kind of a DNS server? This is like a DNS router, DNS record. So who is making these configurations internally? Who is adding these name server details while creating a pods within that containers? We are not doing anything. Is Kubernetes is adding that DNS? I mean to say that name server details to which DNS server it has to go. If you see this 10.96.0.10, what is the IP? Let's see, kubectl get all -n cube system. Guys, if you want to come out of that pod container, what you need to type again? I want to come out of that. Now, if you see this IP, name server IP, whatever I see in that pod containers in this file, what is this IP 10.96.0.10? Is it a service of your Kubernetes DNS? Is it a service IP of your Kubernetes DNS? Which means any DNS lookups are happening within your pod container. Is it going to this kube DNS? And kube DNS is pointing to these core DNS pods. In these core DNS pods, is it maintaining that IP to the name mapping? So, but who is adding these details internally? Who is adding these details internally in each and every pod container in this resolve.conf file? Are we adding manually these details? No. Is Kubernetes is taking care while scheduling, while creating a pods containers? Is it adding these entries internally? So this way, do you have a service discovery also within the Kubernetes? Do you have a service discovery and DNS within the Kubernetes? Yes. But whatever DNS entries are maintained within the cluster, will it resolve in the internet from different servers or different networks? Will that name work outside the cluster? Now, same name, will I able to use outside the cluster? No. Is everyone clear what is service and what is service of type cluster IP, how it is working? You don't need this much internal details, but it will be good if you know how it is working. But at least you should know what is service, how to create service, what type of services we have. Yes. Now I cannot access from outside, but if I want to access from outside, then what needs to be done, guys? If I want to access from outside, what needs to be done? Again, within the cluster I am able to access. If I want to access from outside the cluster, there is a one more type of service. There is one more type of service called what? Node port. Node port. Now I want to access that application from outside the cluster. Do I need to create a service of type node port? Yes. So when I create a service of type node port, it will expose the service on each node IP at node port. Each node IP at node port. What do you mean by node? What do you mean by node? If I create a service of type node port, I can access that service on each node IP. What do you mean by node here? Your server, your Kubernetes node. It is like -p in the Docker. It is like -p in the Docker. So can I create a service of type node port so that I can access using that node IPs and that node port from outside the cluster if I want to reach that application, that service? Yes. So it is something like this. It is something like this. This is your Kubernetes cluster. This is your Kubernetes cluster. These are your nodes, your servers. This is outside. Now, if I create a service of type node port, can I use this node IP from outside if I want to reach that application? Can I use node IP and node port here by creating a node port service? Node IP, server IP, and node port. So from outside, first request goes to that server on that node port. Then is it going to route the traffic to that cluster service, that IP, that cluster IP? From outside request goes to node to your cluster IP, from cluster IP to your pod IPs, from cluster IP to your pod IPs. From outside, request goes to node IP and node port. From there, it will go to cluster IP. From cluster IP, it will route the traffic to your pod IPs. Now, I need to create a node port service if I want to access. But without creating a node port service, will I able to access using node IPs? Now, let's say this is my node, master node. Let's say I'm using public IP address of that node. I'm using that public IP address of that node. If I use something like this, do you think will it work? Even though you open a port, do you think it will work? No. So do I need to create a node port service so that I can use that node IP and whatever node port is created or allocated for that service? Yes. Now, do I need to create a separate service? One service for cluster IP, one service for node port? Do I need to have two different services for same application to access internally and externally? Not required. Not required. You no need to have two services to access internally and access externally. You don't need two service. Single service, same service. Can I create as a node port service instead of cluster IP service? Instead of cluster IP service, can I create that as a node port service? Yes. Now let me do that. Let me do that. Now I want to access from outside also. Instead of cluster IP here, can I create a service of type node port? Can I create a service of type node port? When I am using a node port, can I use one more field here called a node port? The way we have a port, target port, can I use one more field called node port here? This is your server port. On which port you want to reach this service? On which port you want to reach this service? It is not mandatory. It is not mandatory. Even though you don't mention, does Kubernetes will assign some node port? Will it assign some random node port? Yes. What is the node port range? When I was explaining architecture, I told what is the node port range in Kubernetes, in which range the node port will be allocated, or I can use 30,000 to 32,767. 30,000 to 32,767. Can I use, if I want to use some fixed port, can I say something like this, 30,000, 33, within that range, anything? But if this is already used for some other service in that node, do you think will you be able to reuse this port again? No. So I can use like this, but make sure you are not using that port again. But even though you don't mention, does Kubernetes will assign one node port in that range, whatever range, and which is not already used? Yes. Now let me do this. Before applying, let me show you, as of now, what type of service it is. As of now, what type of service it is. Before applying, let me show you. As of now, what type of service it is? Cluster IP. Now in my YML, I have changed. In YML, I have changed from cluster IP to node port. Now let me make the changes. Now you see, this time what type of service it is? Node port. Now I see one more port here. I see one more port here. This port 80 is what, guys? This port 80 is what? Is it a container port or target port? No. That is service port. Service port. And what is this one? 30,077 node port. Now, still within the cluster, can we use this service name still? Let's say this pod want to access this pod. Can they still use this service name? Will it result to this IP within the cluster? Even though this is node port, within the cluster, they can still use this service name, which means does this application can still use this name to communicate with applications or APIs running in this pod within the cluster? Come on, guys. There is no rocket science here. Can I still use that from this application? I want to access that application. Can I still use this service name within the cluster? Within the cluster, I can still use this service name. Something like this. Maven-web-application. Something like this I can use within this cluster. But now outside the cluster, now this is my cluster. Now I want to use outside. Will I able to use that service IP from outside? We already verified. Am I able to reach that service IP, that cluster IP directly? No. But now, did I created a service of type node port? Did I created a service of type node port? In each and every node, on which port that service is listening as of now? In each and every node, in which port that service is listening? If you see, what is that node port? What is that node port? Is it opening on 30,077? It is listening. It is listening on 30,077. Now, if I want to access from outside, can I use this server IP or this server IP or any other server IP, node IP, which is part of my cluster? This is my cluster. This is my cluster. This is one node. This is another node. This is another node. Can I use any node IP, which means server IP, and this node port 30,077? Now, request goes to that node. First request goes to that node. Is this port is listening 30,077 is listening on that node port, kind of a host port. Now request goes to that one on that port. Then internally will it route the traffic to that cluster IP you are not accessing? Is that node port is routing the traffic to that cluster IP, and is that cluster IP is routing the traffic to your pod IPs? Yes. Now let me use that node, any node. Does it needs to be always master node? Does it needs to be always worker node? Any node is fine. Let me use any node. But as of now, this node has a public IP, public subnet. So will I able to use these public IPs from internet also, from a different networks also? Will I able to reach because that node has a public IP? And what is that port? 30,077. Now my application context. But one thing here, AWS concept, do I need to open a firewall now? Do I need to open a firewall this on this 30,077 AWS concept? In whatever node, I am trying to use this node. In that node, security group, I'll open. You may think already you have opened all traffic, but why you are not able to reach? Even though you have opened all traffic, why you are not able to reach from here? I have opened the traffic, but did I open the traffic for all the IPs or only this range? Only VPC range. Is my laptop IP is in same range where I have already opened the traffic? No. So now, can I open that something like this 30,077, that node port for everywhere? I mean to say any IP like this. Now, if you see, am I able to reach that application now via that node IP and that node port? Am I able to reach that application now? Now, I have customized my code. I have customized my code. I have customized my code where it is printing the host name and IP address. So if you see, is it printing my IP address of that pod, which means is this application is running inside your pod, inside this container, this is your pod IP. Just I have customized this one. So it is showing like this. It is showing like this. Now, which means from outside the cluster, can I access like this using node IP, that is your server IP and that server port. Within the cluster, if any application want to communicate with this application, they need to use any server IPs or pod IPs again within the cluster. If one more application want to reach this application, do they need to use this node IP, node ports or pod IPs? Not required. Can they use this name, the name of that service? Outside node IP and node port. If you see, when I created a service of type node port, in each and every node, is that port is listening? Let me open, execute this netstat command, netstat -tulnp. These are the options. Netstat software is not there. Let me install this netstat. Let me use this netstat option. Now let me use this command, node sudo netstat -tulnp. Now can I see that port 30,077? Is it listening in that server? This is one of the node. This is one of the node, master node. In that node, do I have this 30,077? That node port is listening. So who is processing? If any request goes to this server on this port, who is processing that request? Proxy. Service is a logical concept. Service is a logical concept, but the actual work is doing by whom? Proxy. So, sir, what is the use of cluster IP? You are talking about this IP. When I am executing kubectl get svc, you are talking about this IP. What is the use of this IP? Abhishek? Still you are not clear what is the use of this IP? You are still not clear why this IP, what is the use of this IP? Even discussing this much, if you are not able to understand, very difficult. So when we are accessing inside or outside, if it is inside, we can use this name. Is this name is resolved to this IP internally using kubedns, core DNS? Yes. Then it is resolved to this IP. Then is this forwarding the traffic to the whatever pods, whatever endpoints, which is part of this service? Yes. Even though you are using this node port, any request comes to that server on this port, again will it route the traffic to this IP? Out from outside you are using node IP and node port. Again, is it routing the traffic to this one? Request is coming to that port, service IP to pod IP. Clear? What is that service? Why we need that service? What is cluster IP service? What is node port service? This is very, very important. Now, this is node port service. Not only in this node, in any other node, in any other node like kubectl get nodes. In this node also, is this port is opened? In this node also, is this port is opened? If I go and see netstat, can I see this port 3077? Yes. What about these ports, guys? I can see six. No, these ports 10250, 6443, because this is my master node. This is my master node in 6443. What is listening on 6443 in the master node? Because this is master node. What is listening on 6443 in the master? API server 10256 Q proxy scheduler etcd. Etcd is listening on which port? Is it using that ports whatever I have given here? Right, all these ports are used. Now this is a node port work. Now I want to access other application also, other pod. I have other application also. How I can access that application again within the cluster or outside the cluster? I want to access this application. How I need to access this application, other application? Again, do I need to create a service for that application to access internally or externally? Do I need to create a service for that application also? Now using this service, I am able to access this application. To access this application internally or externally, do I need to create a service again for that application? Maybe in like this service API version v1 kind service metadata, some name of the service, something like this, node.js app svc namespace, same namespace where I have my pods spec. Now can I directly create a node port? Is it mandatory to go step by step? Not required. You can directly create a node port selector. I need to make sure, is this correct? Is this correct? Even though you created a service with this name, again, is this service also points to the other application now? If you do like this, does this service also points to other application pods, other pod? Yes. So make sure you are using correct selector here. Ports, port. I can give any port. Now target port. What is the target port for this application? 9981. Now if I apply like this, is it going to create a service for with that name? Now do I have a service again for that application also? This service. Now from this application, if I want to reach this application within the cluster, from this application I want to access this application within the cluster, can I use this service name? From this application I want to reach this application, can I use this service name within the cluster? If there is a code, if there is a code which is making API calls, it will work. It will work. Now if I have a curl or wget, I can use this service name. Not sure on which context the API is running. Do you guys remember that Node.js? I think there is something called HTML is there, right? Yeah, let me see, show you. Now, am I able to access 200 response I am getting? 200 response I am getting. And also, let's say there is something called JSON data also, some API called JSON data. Do you see, am I getting that API? I mean to say, getting the response from that API, from that other application. So can I use this service name within the cluster for communicating from one pod, one application to other pod, other application? Yes. Let me type exit. From outside, if I want to access that one, can I use this respective node port? This node port, 30134. 30134. Any node that can be master node, that can be worker node, open that port in the security group. That port 30134 is the port for that one. I'm opening for all the IPs. Now, can I use that port 30134 in whatever node I have opened? That node IP. That node IP and that node port. Something like this. Now I am getting cannot get because nothing is running on the root context. From outside, am I able to access same application using that node IP and node port? Is everyone clear how to access the applications pods which is running within the Kubernetes cluster? From inside the cluster, how you can reach? From outside the cluster, how you can reach? Is everyone clear what is service and how it works? Yes. So how service is identifying the pods? There is a one more command called kubectl get EP. What do you mean by EP here? kubectl get EP. EP stands for endpoints. Endpoints. EP stands for endpoints. Now for this service, is this is the endpoint? For this service, is this is the endpoint? How service is identifying the pods? -o wide. I can use multiple options like this. -o wide, -show, -labels. If you see, is this service is pointing to this pod 10.36.0.1? Is this service have an endpoint like this 10.44.1 like this 44.0.1? Because while creating this service, did I use this as a selector? While creating this service, did I use this as a selector and respect to target ports? You can describe or you can see the endpoints also. So how service will identify the pods? Service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors. Is everyone clear, guys? What is service? How it works? Very important. Communication. Now, can I use this pod, this IPs and ports? I mean to say, can I use this node port from a different server? Let's say I have a different server which is not part of the cluster. I have a different server which is not part of the cluster. Will I able to access that application via this server IP and that port? Do you think will it work via this server IP or this server IP? Can I use this server IP and that port? Do you think will it work? No, because Is that server is part of the cluster? First of all, is this server is part of the cluster? Is this server is part of the cluster? No. In this server, I have a kubectl. In this server, I have a kubectl. Kubectl is different. Accessing the application is different. In this server, I configured kubectl. Am I able to communicate with my API server using this server? But this server is not part of the cluster. This server is not part of the cluster. So will I able to use those pod IPs, service IPs, or node ports from this server? Will I able to access that application via this server IPs? No, because this is not part of the cluster. So only these nodes are part of the cluster. Is everyone clear, guys? What is that service, how it works? Okay. Now tomorrow I'll continue with again pod concept only. In Kubernetes, it is not recommended to create the pods directly. In Kubernetes, it is not recommended to create the pods directly. Why it is not recommended to create the pods directly? If pod is having some issues, if pod goes down, does pod will be automatically rescheduled? If you directly create a pod, if something goes wrong with pod, does pod will be automatically created? No. And also, will I able to scale my pods? Let's say, as of now, I have only one pod. I have only one pod. Is it possible for me to scale up, scale down the pod replicas if I am directly creating a pods? No. It is not recommended to create a pods directly. So instead of creating a pods directly, do I need to use some controllers like replication controller, replica set, deployment, daemon set, which will create the pods and manage the pods for us? Yes. So that I will continue tomorrow. Okay. That's it for today. Try to practice more on service. That is, try to practice more on service. I'll continue tomorrow. What is replication controller? What is replica set? Why we need to use that? What is the problem with pods? Why we should not directly create a pods? I'll continue tomorrow. Thank you guys. That's it for today. I'll see you tomorrow. Go through the recordings multiple times. Practice a lot. Kubernetes will be very easy. If you go through these recordings multiple times and practice, it is very interesting subject. It will become very interesting also. But if you do lot of practice and if you go through the recordings, it will be interesting. Otherwise, it will be a difficult. For everyone. Don't expect holidays. I am covering 1.5 hours. What do you do in the rest of the 24 hours? Even though you are working employee, will you sit and work for 20 hours? No. Even I am working employee. I need to manage a huge team. Maximum you will work for 10 hours. You will have another 10 hours. Let's consider 2 hours is gone for class. Can't you spend 2 more hours for practice even though you are working employee? 2-3 hours you can daily spend even though you are working employee. But if you are a student, will you spend 20 hours also? If you don't have any job, you can spend a whole day. Guys, put some effort. Put some effort and utilize this opportunity. Okay. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. Thank you, guys. I'll continue tomorrow on the next topic.